Silksong has a lot of different enemies. Some of them are really easy, and some of them literally make me want to die. Yeah, anyways, there's a lot of different difficulties throughout all the enemies, and I wondered what the hardest one from each area was. I've done this video with Hollow Knight before, and it's my most popular video, so here we go with Silksong. The enemies I'm considering are all the ones that are unique to each specific area. It also needs to be an enemy. This means we're not counting bosses or mini-bosses. Anyways, let's get on to the video. Starting off with Moss Grotto and Bone Bottom. All the enemies here are easy. It's the first area in the game, and this is expected, though the hardest one out of all of these, I'm gonna say, is the Mauling. It's probably the only one I took damage to, and it's generally really annoying at this specific section. However, I'm actually forgetting a really hard enemy. If you go to the right when you first spawn in, you actually come across the Marrow. This is a super hard enemy, clearly harder than all the others, and I'm saying it's unique to this place because it kind of is, even though it has Marrow in its name. Yeah, this is the hardest enemy here. Let's move on. Next up is the Marrow. The first enemies I thought of was the Killick, Beastfly, or the Karanid. These are all super annoying enemies, especially the Killick. I don't know why, but when these guys are put in small corridors, that's the worst thing ever. But then I remembered in the Flint Beetle quest, you have the Flint Beetles. The explosion trail they leave behind is just really annoying. Next up is Wormways. The enemies in this place honestly are easy, and the only one that really poses a threat is the Kragler. But that's a mini boss, so we're not counting it. That means we're left with the Gromling, the Groms, and the Kraglite, which I've never seen and generally didn't know existed until I was searching for this video. It's really hard to choose a hardest enemy between these three as they're all ridiculously easy and barely enemies. However, Act 3. This is when Wormways becomes hell. The two enemies that are super hard when this happens are the Plasmidas and the Plasmids. Since the Plasmidas aren't really enemies, we're going with the Plasmid as the hardest enemy in Wormways. Next up is Deep Dogs. The first enemy I thought of was the Flintstone Flyer. These guys are like really annoying. However, apart from that, all the enemies are pretty easy until you unlock this key door here. This is what I like to call Deep Dogs 2. This is because it's almost a complete different area and the enemies are a lot harder here. The Deep Diver is definitely a contender as these guys are really annoying, but then I realized that the Lava Lagers exist. And I thought the normal Lava Lugs were bad. These guys absolutely suck, and generally I don't think there's a way through this whole room without taking any damage at all. The Lava Lagers are definitely the hardest enemies here. Farfields is next, and this place has a surprisingly high amount of enemies, though most of these are, well, pretty easy. The hardest enemies here are the Hardbone Elder and the Vicious Karanid. These are both super hard, and it was between these two. But then I remembered that the whole Rhino Grund thing exists, and this may not be a unique enemy to this area, but it is pretty unique to this area. Then I realized it probably counts as a mini-boss anyways, so overall we're going with the Vicious Karanid. These guys are super annoying, they fly, they do 2 damage, and also the amount of times I've died to these guys in like the worst situations possible, where I have to do 4th chorus skip like 20 more times. Yeah, go check that up video out if you want. Anyways, yeah, these guys are really awful. All the enemies in Hunter's March absolutely suck. All the enemies are hard here, and the first ones I thought that were significantly harder than all the others were the Scar Stalker and the Spear Scar. These are super annoying enemies, but then I also remembered we have the Scar Guard. I realized this again is probably a mini-boss, so we're going with the Scar Stalker, as I believe out of all of these are just generally the most annoying ones. When thinking about this place, my mind straight away went to the Silk Snippers. These guys are annoying and they're almost impossible to kill. On my first playthrough, I remember thinking these guys are just stupid. But then I thought that the Thread Rakers are probably harder. They're really annoying and usually I just tend to avoid them rather than trying to kill them. Though after looking at all the enemies, I realized there's a few I'd forgotten about. The Craws are very hard. The Tall Craw and the Squat Craw especially. And the Squat Craw, in my opinion, was the hardest enemy here. But then I realized that the Might Mother is a thing, and this thing is just so much harder than all the others. It does 2 damage, it blocks the hallways, and it just means getting to the Greymoor Bellways is really annoying. There are only 2 enemies in Bellhart, the Firm and the Winged Firm. The Firm is really easy, you just have to hit it and avoid it, though actually attacking it is kind of hard because of its bell shield is its head. Anyways, the Winged Firm is a lot harder because it blocks the hallways, it has a lot more health, and it does double damage, and I generally have died to these a lot of times. Obviously, the hardest enemy in Shellwood is the Pond Skipper. I'm joking, obviously not. My initial thoughts were the Splinter Horn, and the Splinter Bark. I thought these were all the same enemy, but when researching this, there's actually 3 of these guys. If you go to the graves, you actually find the covetous pilgrim. This would be the hardest, though since it's not really unique to Shellwood, we're not counting it. So we'll go with the splinter bark as the hardest enemy. This is because it's the flying one, and all flying enemies suck. For blasted steps, the first thing I thought of was the Drisnets, as they're just super annoying and generally the first enemy that came to mind. But also one that came to me straight away was the Judges. These are really annoying, and the shields just make them so annoying. The Drisnets are probably more annoying, but I remember dying to the Judges a few times more on my first playthrough. The Sands of Karak only has 4 enemies. The Coral Firm, the Poke Nabbin, the Conchfly, and the Driz Naga, which is a big Driz Knight, so definitely the hardest. Until we look at the Coral Tower. This is where we have the Karaka, Yago, the Karak Gore, the Korkros Karaka, and the Yomama. Wait, Yomama? What the hell is... What? Is that a Yomama joke? Okay, anyways. The hardest enemy here is actually a challenge to pick, as all of these are really hard to pronounce and actually to defeat. Overall, I'm going with the Korkros Karaka, as it was super annoying fighting this guy in the arena on the way to crossing Khan. I can't do anything! A lot of the enemies in the Underworks are essentially all called the same thing. I mean, Team Cherry didn't even try with the Underworker. Anyways, we have the Underscrub, the Undersweep, the Underpoke. Okay, come on, what are these names? They're just Underverbs. Seriously, I think the hardest one is easily taken by the Undercrank, as it's the only one that poses any sort of challenge compared to the rest. Now for the Citadel, I decided to split it up into 6 different areas. These are the Coral Chambers, Cogwork Core, High Halls, the Memoriam, Whispering Vaults, and Whitewood. My instant first thought was Claw Maidens. I knew that when Coral Chambers were coming up, this would probably be the one I chose because generally these guys are the most annoying enemy in the whole game. However, we've got to take some other enemies into consideration. The Quiet Elder is a very annoying enemy, along with the Grand Reed, who's almost like a mini-boss in a way with how hard he is. Actually, yeah, I think the Grand Reed is the hardest enemy in the Coral Chambers. Even though the Claw Maidens suck, the Grand Reed is the hardest here. Literally every single enemy here starts with Cogwork, which is kind of funny. Anyway, the hardest of these, although the Cogwork Choir bugs suck, is definitely the Cogwork Clapper. This is a secret enemy found in Act 3 that is almost like a mini-boss. Though it's not, guys, I promise. The only reason the arena does this is because there's 2 of them, which simply means one of these guys wasn't enough for a boss fight. I'm pretty sure there's one of these guys somewhere else anyways, so this guy definitely counts as an enemy and it's the hardest one here. There's only 3 unique enemies really here. These are the Choir Clapper. Okay, why are they obsessed with Clapper? Anyways, the Minister and the Maestro. Maestros are pretty easy to manipulate and kill, so overall the Choir Clapper is the easiest choice here. I mean it's the hardest enemy, but it's an easy choice because, yeah, let's move on. Next up is the Memoriam, which has a surprising amount of unique enemies. The unique enemies here are Crustcrag, Memoria, and the massive Moss Grub. We also have the huge Flea, though I'm pretty sure that's a mini-boss. So that's 3 unique enemies. I don't know why I said surprising amount in the script. I mean, it doesn't seem like there'd be many enemies here, I guess. Anyways, out of these, the hardest is probably the Crustcrag, as although they're easy to avoid, they do double damage and they're kind of annoying. And out of all of the 3, they're definitely the hardest. Here we have the Drape enemies, which are really annoying. These include the Drape Lord and the Giant Drape Mite, 2 very difficult enemies here. We also have the Scroll Reader and the Vault Keeper. Out of all of these, the Drape Lord is the hardest in my opinion, as I remember struggling so much fighting this guy in the air, and they also do double damage. They're just really annoying enemies. Although the Scroll Reader was definitely a runner-up. Now, for the final place in the Citadel, we have Whitewood. I would say the Mortician, if it wasn't so completely predictable. It's the biggest here and does double damage, so that's usually my go-to option. Out of all of them, I would say that the Dregwill is the hardest. This guy's so annoying, and during this boss fight, it was the worst thing ever. This one, I think, is the most difficult out of all of them. Next up is the Slab. The Pentinent and the Wardenfly are the 2 enemies here that are challenging. Though the Wardenflies are the buggers that take one at stuff, and also are just the harder of the 2, so they're definitely the hardest enemy in the Slab. Next up is Mount Fay, and I'm gonna be real, the enemies here are pathetic. There are only 3, and they are the Driftlin, the Mnemoid, and the Servitor Boron. The Driftlin is like the only actual enemy out of these 3, so that's the hardest one in Mount Fay. I mean, the platforming here is the hardest. It's kind of like White Palace in a way, I guess, from Hollow Knight. But yeah, the enemies suck here, so. Mockroaches are the first and probably the hardest enemy here. These guys suck so much. The Roach Keeper is, however, the hardest enemy here. and I can't just put the Mockroaches as the hardest out of spite. The Roach Keepers are also super annoying to kill, so definitely deserve this spot. Though the Mockroaches, oh my god, why did Team Cherry add these? The hardest enemies in most areas tend to be the biggest, and Bilewater has the Bloat Roaches, which are huge. However, in my opinion, the Stilkin is the most difficult in this area. I remember struggling a lot with these guys on my first playthrough, on my 600 trek to Growl the Great, because what the hell is that? Yeah, Bilewater sucks in general, and the enemies suck as well. Yeah, moving on. Wraiths are the only enemies here, but it would actually be wrong if they weren't in a hardest enemies video, because they actually suck. All of the enemies here are actually so bad. The Spit Squid and the Barnack are both extremely annoying enemies. They're probably two of the hardest enemies in the game, however the Ducksucker easily takes this. Like many other enemies, it's like a mini boss, it's the biggest, it does double damage, and it sucks. Next up is Wisp Thicket, and this place only has two main enemies, the Wisp and the Burning Bug. Honestly, because of how the Wisps are used in the boss fight, I had a hard time choosing. However, I've decided to go with the Burning Bug as these guys really piss me off. Originally, I wasn't going to include the Abyss until I realized how many enemies were actually here. It has 5 in total, not including Void Tendrils, even though Team Cherry counts them as an enemy for some reason. Anyways, the hardest enemy here is the easiest choice I've had to make all video, the Gargant Gloom. No explanation needed here. And that's the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and there was actually 3 areas I didn't include because I don't have any enemies, which are Verdania, Red Memory, and the Cradle. Anyways, thanks for watching, please subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.